Yes, I hope everyone can hear me. So welcome all to this second session of the webinar, 20 years after implementing and going beyond the Palermo Protocol. I'm sorry that we could not allow for a break, but I hope we can continue the good discussion we just had. My name is Suzanne Hoff and I'm International Coordinator of Strada International, the European NGO platform against trafficking human beings. As you heard already from the last moderators and the openers of this panel, we will look today and also tomorrow back and reflect back at the impact of the Palermo Protocol, which was adopted 20 years ago. This session, and I would like to proceed immediately with this session we now start, we will discuss in more detail the vulnerability and the rights protection of trafficked and exploited persons in mixed migration flow. Over the last 20 years, we've seen that the anti-trafficking agenda has been at odds with migrant rights and measures to prevent and combat human trafficking, and that they have been used by many governments to justify restrictive migration. And yet we know that restrictive migration policies create vulnerabilities to trafficking, and also that early support to trafficked persons is hampered by a restrictive approach generally adopted by migration authorities. And I'm very pleased to discuss these issues further with the panel. I would like to remind you all who are still online that this session will last till 8 p.m. today. And we have also here included a Q&A, and I hope we managed to get several of your questions answered. Before that Q&A starting, we have four wonderful panelists, and I would like to introduce them shortly and give them the floor. They are Michelle Lefroy, Liliana Sorrentino, Laura Sofia Espinoza, and Geneviève Colas. Before I introduce them, I would like to ask the speakers again to be careful with the time, otherwise I also have to take measures and to inform that you have only 1 minute left. And I would also like to remind the audience again to mute. So let me start with the first speaker. The first speaker is Michelle Lefroy. Since 2006, she's the director of PICUM, the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, a Brussels-based international network of organizations working to ensure social justice and human rights for undocumented migrants. We are also a member of PICUM. PICUM is committed to ensuring that undocumented migrants have a dignified standard of living and rights. And for over 14 years, Michelle has contributed much to the debate on migrants, in particular undocumented migrant rights. And she has been a member of many different boards and advisory committees to contribute to this debate. Michelle, could you maybe let us know how we should correctly understand the relationship between anti-trafficking and migration policy? So that's the first question I would like to raise to you.
Thanks very much, Suzanne, and very happy to be part of this panel and discussion. So I'd like to start with another 20-year anniversary, which wasn't this year, but last year. So it was the EU Common Asylum and Migration Policy, which last year completed 20 years. And what we've observed is that fighting irregular migration has been a hallmark of the EU's Common Asylum and Migration Policies. The EU has focused on prevention, surveillance of borders, returns, readmission agreements, criminalization of humanitarian assistance. And just to give two examples, because there's many, since 2004, when Frontex was established, there have been 4 regulations amending the mandate of Frontex, which shows the increasing importance of this agency. The European Border and Coast Guard Agency regulation from 2019 commits to a new standing core of 10,000 staff by 2027, although we might imagine that this could even be sooner than that. And another example is research from the project called Rizoma, which said that 171 human rights defenders have been criminalized in the past 5 years because they've been providing humanitarian assistance to people with irregular status. So we've seen in a lot of the policy development that trafficking in human beings is regarded as synonymous with irregular migration and the position of undocumented migrants. All of us here in the EU are eagerly awaiting to see what the new pact on migration will be from the EU, but the current EU agenda on migration, which was established in 2015, refers to dismantling smuggling and trafficking networks as a way to reduce irregular migration. And here I quote from this agenda from 5 years ago, quote, "Those claiming asylum will be immediately channeled into an asylum procedure. where EASO support teams will help to process asylum cases as quickly as possible. For those not in need of protection, Frontex will help member states by coordinating the return of irregular migrants. And Europol and Eurojust will assist the host member state to dismantle smuggling and trafficking networks. We think that efforts to address trafficking would be much more effective if it was separated from irregular migration. Because I think what we've heard in the first panel is that trafficking is very complex. There's many different reasons: human rights violations, global inequality, gender discrimination, social exclusion, poverty, that are a cause and a consequence of trafficking. And we see that the criminal law enforcement network is too limited. We need a broader social agenda. And in this, we need to focus really on labor rights. PICUM actually did a report recently called A Worker is a Worker, where we looked at 15 EU member states and some non-EU countries. And we saw that there are many barriers for undocumented workers to report situations of exploitation and within the criminal and civil justice system. The key issue, and I think this Evelyn said in the previous panel, is about not living in fear. So one of the key issues is that someone might actually be deported because they engage with law enforcement or labor inspectorates. This is true even if they have been recognized as a victim due to the temporary nature of special permits for victims of trafficking. And so this doesn't coincide well with migration projects of individuals who have been trafficked. We found also with labor inspectorates, sometimes they carry out their inspections with the police. This can lead to arrest, detention, and deportation. Reporting personal information of undocumented workers to immigration authorities varies. There's not always professional confidentiality, and there's no security for a worker that if they go to a labor inspector, they won't be reported to immigration enforcement. So basically, just to conclude on this point, the lack of safeguards in prioritizing labor rights protection and victim protection over immigration enforcement is a key barrier to identifying people who are trafficked. And so we really have to focus on complaints mechanisms, effective complaints mechanisms.
Thank you very much also for raising those critical challenges, which we also see every day. What kind of message do you think on regular channels of migration and residence permits could have or have already a significant impact on the vulnerabilities to trafficking and exploitation?
Mm-hmm. I think what we see is that, first of all, the fact that there are very few possibilities for migrant workers from third countries outside the EU to receive work and residence permits to work regularly in key sectors also can lead to trafficking. Sometimes they tie, any permits that exist tie a specific job to a particular employer. If they want to change employer, they might have to reapply for a new permit from their country of origin. If they lose their job, their residence and work permit becomes invalid. So all of this creates excessive dependency on the employer. And it also actually creates a vast decent work deficit. So high levels of labor exploitation, trafficking, workplace accidents, etc. So we actually advocate for improved regular entrance and residence permits. And we wanted to highlight 5 key elements of what those should be. So the first one is mobility by choice and not coercion. So we see that short-term permits actually can lead to labor exploitation. Sometimes when they don't have rights, they don't have also enough time to understand how these procedures are, and also to file a complaint if need be. Also, if the permit is less than 1 year and it's not renewable, this can also lead to exploitation and dependency. So really not coercing the worker. The second one is independence from employers. So the permit should not be tied to one employer in particular. An individual should be able to change their employer, including the job, their sector. They should be able to work for more than one employer and to have a period of time of unemployment to look for other work in case they lose that position. They should be able to apply for a permit themselves to reduce their dependency on potential employers. And this offer of employment should be sufficient. The current system where limiting work permits to certain occupations and using labor market tests don't really reflect the reality of labor market needs. The third point is in-country applications. So people should be able to apply for residence and work permits provided by the national law from within the country, regardless of their status. Restrictions on people changing from one type of status or permit should be lifted, and more pathways to regularize statuses are needed. And any type of regularization should be based on clear criteria and implemented with local civil society organizations. There's been a lot of discussion about the regularization in Italy, and so we might get to that in the discussions, but an interesting model actually. The fourth one, equal treatment and labor rights. Work permit schemes should be accompanied by complementary labor market policies to ensure that labor standards are enforced for all workers, regardless of their status. Any targeted measures to ensure migrant workers have meaningful access to information, legal advice, NGOs, and trade unions, and regulating agencies and holding them accountable along supply and subcontracting change is also crucial. And I think we heard this in the last panel. And the last point is social inclusion. Migrant workers should be able to enjoy their family life as any other person. Restrictions on low-income migrant workers from bringing their families should be lifted. Currently, the majority of migrant workers can only bring their families if they're highly skilled and earning a high salary. And there should be pathways to resettlement after a number of years. All periods of residence that the migrant worker would have done should count towards long-term resident status. And just to conclude, social dialogue is obviously a hallmark of migration or of labor policy, but this also does not take into consideration the reality that many civil society organizations, many migrant worker initiatives are also key actors in labor. So we need to have structured dialogue and consultation, not only with trade unions as social partners, but also NGO and worker associations. They should also have a seat around the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a comprehensive overview of what needs to be done. I hope we can push this forward. I very much support all the recommendations you made, and I will later try to summarize some of them. But without further ado, also to have more time for the discussion later on, I would like to go to the next speaker, which is Liliana Sorrentino. She lives currently in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and she has worked over 15 years in the anti-trafficking debate. She worked for the OSCE Special Representative, but she also worked for a lot of other international organizations, including the Council of Europe, the European Commission, ILO, UNHCR, as a consultant, doing research, providing trainings. And I'm also more than happy to say that she's currently a board member of Strada International. Liliana, welcome to join this webinar. We've seen that the traditional identification model is actually strongly relying on police operations at the moment, and also a law enforcement-led identification process. And that is, again, closely linked to assistance and criminal proceedings that is actually also promoted in the Palermo Protocol, or at least embedded in the Palermo Protocol. Can you maybe elaborate on this identification model that we currently see and how it has actually proven ineffective, if you agree with that? You should be, could be that someone else unmute. Yes.
Yes.
Go
okay,
ahead.
I found it. Sorry, it disappeared on my screen. So again, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Suzanne. I wish also good evening to everyone who is watching or listening to us today that we can't see. I would like to start by also taking a moment just to thank the Special Rapporteur and On the Road for the possibility to join this webinar and this really thought-provoking discussion and reflection, I think, on the Palermo Protocol. And I also thank you, Maria Grazia, for your leadership throughout the mandate and also for bringing us together today and tomorrow. So back to your question, Susanna, which I think is a very important one. And my first answer, yes, the identification model does not work. I really I really think that this model, which is being developed within the framework of law enforcement and immigration control, has been really proven ineffective. If we simply look at the number of those people who have been recognized as victims of trafficking, it's really derisory compared to the scale of people that we estimate as being trafficked. And this is also, and there are I think 4 big reasons I would like to mention. The first one is that this model is really at odds, in contradiction with the human rights perspective, which places the individual at the center and the recognition of the individual's rights and needs at the center, as well as it's premised on the recognition that it's the state that has the responsibility to guarantee the rights of everyone under their jurisdictions, regardless of their status, so without any discrimination, including irregular immigration status, of course. The second, I think, big reason for this failure is that this traditional victim identification paradigm has come with the labeling and singling out the victims of trafficking. What do I mean with this? The idea behind this paradigm is that it's based on the exceptionality and non-consensuality of trafficking. So the idea was that victims of trafficking needed to be singled out and distinguished from others, irregular migrants, alien or irregular workers or prostitutes, because of and they deserve the special treatment because of the exceptional and tremendous abuse and harm they have suffered. However, many of these other social constructs, like irregular migrants, alien, prostitute, they are really much more powerful to recognize and also to be applied. So the result is that, in my view, that very often identification means deportation or detention, as we have heard also earlier on from Parosha. So it should be challenged as a paradigm. The point that I want to make is that this law enforcement approach to victim identification has also come together with a very strong caveat, which is problematic, and it's a conditionality of assistance. So the labeling means also distinguishing those victims who are deserving protection from those who do not deserve protection. And what is the criteria? The criteria is their cooperation and the value of their cooperation with the law enforcement authority. This is a mechanism. This is basically the idea is that you will be granted assistance if you cooperate with the investigation. So it's a reward mechanism that has as a philosophy and the idea behind working with criminals, with pentiti, with the collaborators of organized crime. Is definitely not the response to someone who is a victim of crime or of human rights violation. And not only this, this is also against the obligations that states have towards the victims of crime in terms of protection, assistance, and redress. And even more, it does not work in the sense that people has not been proven successful in encouraging people to report their situation and to seek justice. So I think these are really three big reasons that show that it does not work. And I would like to add a fourth one, which also echoes what Michelle and also Evelyn earlier have mentioned. This model does not recognize the complexity of the real life experience of individuals who are exploited and or vulnerable to exploitation, and does not take into account the real aspiration. So this identification model is basically seeking to get the testimony of the victims, but in exchange for that, there is no compensation, and there is also nothing in response to the fears, to the needs for certainty, legal certainty, for a long-term status, for a long-term perspective that would be a durable solution. So there is no, the main question remains to me, what is the purpose and benefit of being identified? So I would end your question with it this way.
Thanks so much for highlighting all these difficulties we see, like the deserving or not deserving victim, and also the close dependency, the strong dependency on the cooperation with the authorities, with the law enforcement. You mentioned to raise a lot of bottlenecks, but do you also see how the system could change? If you, based on your reflection, how could early support and more inclusive social protection of vulnerable and exploited persons actually be promoted? Do you see ways out?
Yes, I see some ways out, and I'll try to reflect on them. And I think the first, the point of departure in this reflection for me is the recognition that exploitation has really systemic and structural features. And this is an important point, because otherwise we risk, because we have to avoid disguising the responsibility of states for those factors and for those policies that basically legally construct dependency, legally construct discrimination, and that shape vulnerability. So we also need to understand, I think, the concept of vulnerability in a more sophisticated way. We have to recognize that vulnerability is connected with the discrimination and with the inability of effectively exercising rights, all rights. And discrimination shapes the experience of the individual who is vulnerable to exploitation and to abuse, because influence that power imbalance that is used to abuse the person, that is used to exploit the person. So when we look at exploitation, we find that it's very often interconnected with discrimination on gender, on race, on ethnicity, or on irregular status. And we need to adopt an approach to this which is based on human rights and which is also intersectional. I mean that, for example, for an African girl, being black and being in a situation of separated from her family shapes her vulnerability to abuse in a different way than another girl also separated from her family but of another color. So we have to look at the intersection of different grounds of discrimination and how they form vulnerability. And I think that this is a point of departure for the responses in recognizing those individuals who are vulnerable and in providing them protection. When we look at mixed movements and mixed migration flows, there are people, the men, women, and children. They move seeking escaping persecution, seeking safety, or seeking opportunities. And all of them, in the majority of cases, they go through really many experiences of abuse, of very serious violation of their rights, of violence. They're exposed to many life-threatening situations. So they do have, yes, very diverse and specific individual needs, but it's not really possible, I think, to immediately and quickly distinguish among them. And it does also not make very much sense to always make those distinctions immediately if you take into account the severity and the gravity of the abuses and violations that they have provided. So I would say that the responses has to be based on human rights and has to be providing immediate and urgent assistance to address those needs of the individuals and their unique vulnerability, also recognizing that they are resilient. So to this, I think there are four course of actions, which also echo what Michelle was suggesting. The first is that we need early and unconditional support for a much broader group of individuals who are vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. And this has to start with a minimum basic protection measures, physical and mental health, and legal counseling. We need support as also to come unconditional. And also this will help to encourage people to come forward and ask for assistance, and will enable the redress for the variety of abuses and violations of their rights that they have experienced. The second point is that we need to use all possible frameworks, and we need to leverage all human rights framework. So we need to use the anti-discrimination framework, we need to use the refugee protection framework, we need to use child protection, we need to use the measures for victims of crime and for anti-discrimination, and there are many others. And this has to be done in a concerted and coherent way, not excluding. If I'm a trafficked person and I'm receiving a temporary permit for cooperation with the authority, and then my permit expires, I still enjoy the right to seek asylum. If and this cannot be. Yes, I close quickly. Thank you. So these frameworks need to work in a coherent and synergic way that places the best interests of the person and their wishes and aspirations at the center. The other important point that I want to make is that migration control cannot override human rights protection, cannot override the protection of labor rights, protection of rights as a refugee, as a victim of crime, and etc. That's a very, I think it's a cornerstone. And we need to recognize and promote a much bigger role of NGOs and civil society organizations in providing. We need to recognize that we have learned from NGOs providing support to people and accompanying them in towards the process of empowerment, of seeking justice, for remedies of stabilization, that we need to listen to them. They need to be provided psychosocial health, psychosocial support, mental and legal health, mental health, legal counseling. So all these are all very important examples of victim assistance that should be provided to a wider group. And to conclude, I think really I wish for responses that really are organized or are at different levels, at the level of the individual, at the level of the structural factors, at the level of the community, and that also address these power dynamics and power imbalances that is shaping discrimination and vulnerability. We also need to recognize that many of these persons, they are really resilient. They have the strength and the capacity to adapt and to overcome those experiences, and we need to help them enlarging the circle of support so that they are also even more resilient. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liliana, for your call for unconditional support, for more awareness for the vulnerability of such a much larger group, and to really improve the standards to all, the protection standards to all, and to look also at the root causes like discrimination for human trafficking. Thanks so much. I would like to go already to the next speaker, and just for the matter of time, so that people who are listening today also have time to get their questions answered. So my next speaker in the panel is Laura Saver Espinoza. She's a retired New York State Supreme Court justice professional. She worked in New York and in Bronx counties for nearly 20 years. And she has an extensive history for work with government, human rights, and legal organizations in the US, but also in Latin America. She's currently the executive director of the Fair Food Standards Council, which monitors the development of a sustainable agricultural industry that advances the human rights of farm workers, the long-term interest of growers, and the ethical supply chain concerns of retail food companies. We already spoke a little bit about it in the first session. And they also they do this through the implementation of the Fair Food Program, about which Laura will tell us more. Laura, we already heard from the other two speakers about the vulnerability of migrant workers for the exploitation of human trafficking, also partly due to labor migration policies and the fact that, of course, they lack access to protection and support due to, of course, the current identification model, as Liliana stated, or because, as Michelle stated, the lack of safe reporting and complaint mechanism. If we talk more about reducing vulnerability and the protection and empowerment of workers, could you tell us maybe what's the added value of workers-led initiatives such as the Fair Food Program to ensure safety, fair working conditions, but also, of course, fair wages? Maybe otherwise, sorry, Laura, maybe otherwise for the matter of time, I go first to Geneviève and then maybe you can see if it works and I give you the floor afterwards. I'm sorry for that. Then I would like to go to the person who was supposed to be the last speaker, but is now earlier. And this is Geneviève Collas from Caritas Internationalis. She's based in France. And Caritas Internationalis is a confederation of over 160 members who are working at the grassroots level in almost every country of the world. And Geneviève coordinates the collective Together Against Trafficking Human Beings for Caritas Europe. She has been at the forefront to promote the rights of trafficked and exploited children. And Geneviève, I would like to then raise my first question to you. Could you tell us a bit more on what the main challenges are related to the protection of the rights of children on the move?
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. The first challenge for me is to build migration policies based on children's protection. The minor's interest must be the first, but actually many migration policies are based on security at the expense of children protection. Security, entre guillemets. The second challenge for me is to accept in all countries minors at the border. If a person at the border says he or she is a child, he or she must be accepted. The child should benefit from the adult until it is truly demonstrated that he or she is an adult. And actually, it's not the reality at the borders, not at all borders. In France, for example, with Italiana or with England. The third challenge is information about unaccompanied migrant children needs to be made known to the general public and child professionals. It is important to combat preconceived ideas, to fight against any form of racism towards minorities or otherwise. And training is necessary for professionals from the justice, police, education, social actors, doctors. The fourth challenge is the registration of children at birth in all countries must be improved so that every child has a clearly established identity, because there are gaps actually in registration and identification of unaccompanied migrants and gaps in the referral to the appropriate protection service because this bad registration of children. The fifth challenge is in each country, it is important to have a good guardianship systems, and we don't have it in many countries. To balance the protection of children and the recognition of their status as victims of trafficking in human beings, it is necessary to always consider and respect best interest of the child. The creation and establishment in each country on a mandatory basis of a mechanism, a referential mechanism for the detection, identification, referral, and support of victims of human trafficking, known or suspected, would be a major step forward in preventing and combating child trafficking. This would have to take into account the police, the judiciary, teachers, educators, social workers. It would have to be known to all persons who may come into contact with children. And for the last point for this question, a human rights approach, based approach consistent with the International Convention of the Rights of the Child must be put in place for every child. In each country, the national human rights institution, as well as the human rights defender, should facilitate this. There are 4 general principles given by the UN Convention of the Right of the Child: non-discrimination, the right to life, survival, and development, respect for the views of the child, and devotion to the child's best interest.
Thanks so much. You mentioned several times that it's so much needed that the best interest of the child is followed. Could you tell us a little bit more which measures need to be taken to ensure that measures follow the best interest of the child and that human trafficking of children or child trafficking is addressed?
As Caritas network, Caritas Internationalis, and our partners, we propose to make the fight against trafficking of human beings a public policy of its own in each country. And it will be good for the child, for the children. And it's very important to have it. There needs to be end to addressing child trafficking as a subcategory of trafficking in human beings in order to consider children's specific needs and rights. Stop penalizing victims for unlawful acts committed as a direct result of their exploitation, and respect the principle of non-incrimination established by the Warsaw Convention. This provision should be included in the national anti-trafficking legislation. Increase the use of legal qualification in human beings. Authorities often use other articles in the criminal code to prosecute trafficking cases, in particular the offense of soliciting prostitution of minors, illegal labor, or the offense of labor and living conditions against human dignity. We want that the qualification is trafficking in human beings. Respect the procedure of evaluation involving assessing age and a situation of the minor, the non-refoulement of minor principles, the presumption of minority, and the appointment of legal representative when it deals with children in the move. Take into account the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder in the age assessment procedure and ensure that the age assessment procedure is conducted in a caring manner. Just to finish, ensure that children are not arbitrarily denied formal recognition of a minority, as I said just before. Implement a protection adequate to the situation of children on the move. Emergency centers closer to border crossings areas would enable a faster and more efficient case management.
Thanks so much also for mentioning again the non-punishment, and this time for children, that it's very important, which was stressed already also by Parosha before. And of course, linking again to the root causes that we see. I thank you so much, and I hope that we can go back to Laura, although she's still on the phone. Laura, can you hear us? Could you maybe just try to see if it works? Maybe it just works. No? No, I cannot hear you. No. Okay, I think I have a question. Sorry, I did not notice that before. Well, Laura, you're still trying? There was a question to any of the panelists. What are some suggestions for increasing and improving cooperation between actually trafficking efforts that either focus on sexual exploitation, the human trafficking for sexual exploitation, and human trafficking for labor exploitation? How can we ensure that there's more linkages, and how can we improve the cooperation between both fields? That's the question. Who does want to answer this question?
It's a difficult question because I am not sure that there are a lot of cooperation between the two domains.
I mean, we at International. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
For us in France, at the beginning, trafficking in human beings was alone for sexual exploitation, and it's very difficult to explain that there are different forms of trafficking in human beings. And for me, it's important to speak about each part, each form of trafficking human being, and to see how we can work with the same institution, with the same police, justice, education, but we must have some focus on the different forms of trafficking human being. For me, I think that it's important.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone of the others wants to react. We at La Strada International sometimes see also sometimes an artificial in connection, I would say. I mean, sometimes, if we talk about empowerment of people, why to exclude certain groups over another? Michelle, do you want to react?
Yeah, I would also add that if you just take the perspective of the individual, I think it was the mayor of Palermo who said in the opening, if I remember correctly, he was just impressed with looking at the original text of seeing how many times the person is mentioned and not the victim. And so, like, if you just take the experience of the person in front of you, whatever they're doing as work, and if that happens to be in the sex work industry and they're exploited and they cannot access justice, or they're abused by a client and they can't file a complaint to the police because they are criminalized, their work is criminalized, then it really leads to a lot of disempowerment of individuals, whatever they're doing, whether they're cleaning toilets, whether they're picking tomatoes, whether they're in this industry. So, I mean, what we've really looked at is just access to justice, whether it's the police, whether it's law enforcement, or access to justice, whether it's labor inspectors. But there are huge challenges, as you rightly said, Suzanne, in looking at the individual and what they're doing. And I think that actually creates a lot of divisions, unfortunately, because at the end of the day, we're still not looking at the individual and what they most likely need to make sure that they're safe, that they can make sure that they have their wages paid.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much. There's also another question, and it's a pity that the other speaker could still not talk, because I think her empowerment program, or the Fair Food program, it also shows how you can empower people. And this would actually also work for sex workers, but also for other groups. So I think in general, we need programs and voices of people in every sector that they work. There's one more question I see, and that's actually more about multidisciplinary identification. So Liliana, I think it's more for you. The question is actually, should social services providers be more allowed or more engaged to identify victims of trafficking, and also provide them with kind of a formal social status as a victim? And might this also maybe help them to delink the provision of assistance more from the criminal justice approach?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. I think, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you for, it's a good question. I think the others also would like to comment. Of course, I think that social actors should be involved into responding to the individual, and also in identifying the vulnerability. And with social actors, I mean, they can include the public authorities, but they should definitely include the civil society organizations. And I see a much bigger role for NGOs in being able be more flexible and able to recognize vulnerability and to work with the person in making this situation of exploitation and abuse emerge. So definitely yes, and this is one way to separate the response from the criminal justice response. And then of course, as if we place the person at the center, then is the individual's best interest and what the person wishes to do, and how wishes to have a redress for his or her rights. That may include involving reporting to the authorities and being involved, collaborating if they wish so. But I think it should be completely separate, and also centered on their rights as an individual who has been abused and exploited.
Thanks so much. And of course, Michelle
and I think there is, it's very important that it's in the social actors, there are the NGOs, because we have seen that sometimes, even if it is a social identification, the process is so formalized that it's used contrary to the interest of the person. So it's used to exclude rather than to include.
Yeah, and also we see at the moment that when NGOs are needed, this formal identification is still very much needed, which in the end they have not much to say about. There's also another question, but Michelle and Geneviève, feel also free to still answer to this question, but I'll read already the other question, which is related to the regularization program procedure, I must say, in Italy. If this procedure risks actually being counterproductive in terms of exposing individuals to exploitation, considering that it seems to be, I'm just reading the question, considering that it seems to be replicating the substantive flaw that we have been discussing with respect to the anti-trafficking framework, namely being based on state needs rather than on a comprehensive human rights-based approach.
D31A5.
Michelle?
Yeah, it's thanks for the question. We actually held there's a little bit of an echo.
Yeah, maybe other panelists should hear. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Well, hold on. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Oh, great.
Yes, we can hear you. We just allowed Michelle to finish her sentence, and then we listen to you. 1 second. Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we had a webinar, I think it was last week, on regularization and on labor in general. And a lot of the civil society, I think, recognized that Italy most likely would not have foreseen. In fact, one of the panelists in our webinar said this. If anyone had said that Italy would launch a regularization program that, up to tens of thousands or more workers would be regularized. If that would have been announced in January of this year, they said it would have been electoral suicide. So you would never actually propose that as a policymaker. And yet it happened. So I mean, that in a sense is already a first, that we have a regularization of this potential nature in 2020. When we had heard in a lot of our presentations about this whole migration enforcement approach and security to migration. And so having a regularization in itself that's potentially so big is a step forward. Obviously, none of the regularization programs that have taken place in Europe in the past 20 years have ever been perfect. The criteria are always going to be, there's always going to be faults with criteria. And this is something that we actually hope with some research that ODIHR might be doing from the OSCE and others, that we might actually start gathering a repertoire of what are actually the criteria for regularization. What should be the criteria? Because while there's a lot of mapping in Europe, and the big study on regularization called Regine looked at kind of regularization programs over a 13-year period, there's a lot of mapping about what has been done, but not necessarily a lot of really in-depth studies on what should be done in terms of criteria. So I think that's what we also have to look at going forward. But I think it just goes back to some of the things now in the regularization program. It currently is a status of only up to a year. So the question remains, what would happen then after the year? When we were saying in our presentation to recommend accumulating time spent, and that could be used to having more longer term status, that's a key point. And also, can the worker have another job with an employer, or are they tied to that employer? So all of these criteria about regular pathways also apply in a sense to regularization. So we really have to be very in depth about looking at what are the best criteria going forward.
Thanks so much. Thanks for answering that question. And now, Laura, without further we're letting you wait. I hope that everything works. And I would like to go back to the question that I raised to you earlier. Could you tell us what's the added value of workers-led initiatives such as the Fair Food Program to ensure the safety, the fair working conditions, and fair wages for workers?
Yes, and first of all, thank you so much both for the invitation and the patience while we triumph over technology one more time. I just also want to let you know the first answer is extensively longer than the second, so don't worry about the time, it will all fit. Again, without further intro, worker-driven social responsibility programs are built on the indisputable truth that workers are the most credible experts on the topic of how, when, and by whom their human rights are violated in the workplace. Therefore, it is their priorities, experience, and insight that inform worker-driven social responsibility program standards and have been used to construct what are, in effect, private regulatory systems. To ground this idea in a specific example, it was participants in the Agricultural Workers Human Rights Organization that established the Fair Food Program, the coalition of Immokalee workers, who understood the need to go beyond their direct employers for solution to workplace abuse, including human trafficking and forced labor. In their case, many critical legal protections were lacking, and collaborating in 15 years of investigating large-scale forced labor operations and numerous prosecutions of perpetrators and traffickers, perpetrators of forced labor and traffickers, had not solved any of the underlying issues. Low-level contractors indeed went to prison, but the cycle of large and in some cases multinational growing operations continuing to market, to send their produce to market, and the cycle of abuse continuing repeated. That realization moved the workers to look to the top of the supply chain for answers. And after over a decade of campaigning, they were able to forge a consumer worker alliance powerful enough to compel brands at the top of their supply chain to sign legally binding agreements. It's those binding agreements specifying market consequences, strong and serious market consequences for non-compliant suppliers, that stand behind the program's worker-generated, human rights-based code of conduct. And the vast majority of code standards could really be summed up by saying, follow the law, which there was no political will to enforce. But there are also a number of critically important provisions prioritized by workers that go well beyond US law. Additionally, implementation and enforcement mechanisms do go significantly beyond any legal requirements to ensure an end to abuse where enforcement was previously lax or non-existent. Core code standards that are focused specifically on eliminating the root causes of forced labor and other systemic abuse range from direct hire requirements and recruitment of guest workers only through one specified, clean, and carefully monitored channel to zero tolerance provisions for forced labor, meaning that if forced labor is found in an operation, that operation can no longer sell to any of the participating buyers in the program. The same for child labor, violence of any kind, and sexual harassment with physical contact if the violent individuals or sexual predators are not fired. Beyond this, there are new harvesting standards that eliminated long-term wage theft and safety protocols for many of the endemic dangers in agriculture that do surpass the law, but more importantly are actually enforced because workers are empowered to report when violations occur. How does this empowerment happen? Worker education at the time of hire and during in-person sessions with the program's education committee, health and safety committees that meet monthly to raise work environment concerns with management, a designated monitoring organization that combines in-depth audits and a 24/7 complaint mechanism, all of which ensure protection for workers against retaliation of any kind backed by those market consequences. Similarly, worker-driven social responsibility programs founded in Vermont by dairy workers have standards particular to their workplaces. In Lesotho, Southern Africa, female garment workers have established standards aimed at eliminating gender-based violence and harassment. And in Bangladesh, the program created by apparel workers has rectified life-threatening conditions, all by harnessing the market power of the brands with agreements that require cut-offs of sales for non-compliance. Informed workers in these programs become the frontline monitors of their own rights, raising concerns at education sessions, interacting with the formal monitoring organizations during audits and through the complaint hotlines. I just really want to emphasize that worker leadership in monitoring is not a nicety or something to be tacked on. It's rather essential to compliance with program standards, given that no social responsibility auditing organization or government agency can be present or have insight into all times or places relevant to enforcement, nor can an outside monitoring organization be effective without input from workers who speak free of retaliation. So worker-driven social responsibility really puts these tools, a worker-inspired code, rights education, access to auditors, and a protected complaint mechanism into the hands of workers who, through their use, eliminate the worst practices and actors in their workplace, thereby disrupting the previous power dynamic with perpetrators of forced labor and human trafficking. And I will just say that it is no coincidence that while these massive cases were surfacing year after year in the states where the Fair Food Program was born, now those cases are not surfacing because now it is very bad for business to have those practices and to have those bad actors. The last thing I want to say about this is the special rapporteur did ask me to say 2 words about how we were able to deal with the pandemic, although that was not the subject of my initial question, but really the same underlying principles uniquely positioned the Fair Food Program to build a multi-layered approach to COVID-19, which has hit particularly hard in US agriculture. And at a time when no national guidance for the agricultural workplace existed, because of the unique relationship with participating growers in the program and their responsibility to provide a safe environment, we were able to make recommendations and to monitor implementations of best practices for prevention and response on participating farms. And in contrast, perhaps you have seen some of the headlines. Farm workers outside the program, farm workers are designated as essential, but their lives are treated as expendable. They're transported on crowded buses, they live in crowded substandard housing, and their exposure has been tremendous. But you know, the overall picture is that illness has been minimal for workers on Fair Food Program farms, while sadly, given the lack of governmental leadership at national, state, and local levels, COVID-19 continues to rage in these communities.
Thanks so much. And I think for all of us, this Fair Food Program is a very excellent model and example. And I think we need this for Europe too. So let's hope we get it. Just also because of a matter of time, I just want you to elaborate, but very shortly, in order to be able to conclude on time, because I think for a lot of watchers, listeners, it's already quite late today, a long day. Could you explain a little bit, because you mentioned already the vulnerability of female workers also for sexual harassment and violence, how you include the gender aspect in this program?
Absolutely. And I won't have to repeat all of the above, the mechanisms, because they are the same. But in addition to the success in eliminating forced labor, we have also been able to end gender-based violence on Fair Food Program farms. And that is true, even though 80% of female agricultural workers across the US report being victims of sexual harassment or violence. How does that happen? Given how prevalent these abuses were in the codes, workers decided they wanted to set a standard of zero tolerance for sexual harassment with physical contact of any kind, very different from the criminal standard that needs to be proven. So if a supervisor is found to have committed sexual harassment with physical contact and they are not terminated, or a co-worker, the employer will be suspended from the program and therefore ineligible to engage in sales to the program's participating buyer. When faced with the decisions up to now between defending a supervisor or an employee who is a sexual predator and the ability to sell its product, participating growers have always managed to make the right decision. So through complaints and auditing in a context that's completely free of retaliation of any kind, workers have used that power to make credible reports of abuse and protect their work environment. They don't have to go to court, they don't have to file a paper, they are not subject to confronting their abuser. It is an alternative dispute resolution process. And so all forms of harassment and discrimination are prohibited by the code. And there is extensive education done with both supervisors and workers so that they are aware that anyone who violates these standards are subject to disciplinary action and eventual termination for repeated, for failure to comply. And those enforcements against discrimination have also led to much more equitable work assignments. And finally, because a safer work and more equitable work environment was created after the initial 2 or 3 years of enforcement on Fair Food Program farms, we saw an increase in the workforce that almost doubled female participation from the pre-implementation days.
Thanks so much for this. And it also links again to Michelle asking earlier for complaint mechanism and safe reporting. I think it's a good example here as well. I would like to thank you all very much. And I'm sorry we cannot discuss this further. But of course, tomorrow there is another webinar. Before I quickly announce also I would like to wrap up. I will not bother myself by repeating everything that you already said and try to be all-inclusive, because it has been so much. But of course, we discussed the vulnerability of migrants, including those on the move, undocumented migrants, the need to ensure legal labor migration channels, and also, as just said, to look more for opportunities, legal opportunities for migrants to work, and also for exploited workers, of course, to access rights, to get information, safe reporting, and also, of course, the need for an establishment of a firewall between the access to social services and migration checks, and as raised also by Michelle, the complaint mechanism, and actually also by Laura in the end. Then, of course, the issue was discussed about the lack of identification and the strong focus still on the law enforcement, while we actually need a much more look much more at vulnerability, the need for unconditional support, and actually access for a much larger group to assistance and support for everyone who's very vulnerable, and that it should not be dependent on a start or an outcome of criminal procedure. And we also talked about multi-stakeholder initiatives to address the root causes of human trafficking and child trafficking, for example, to also ensure that every child is registered at birth. And Geneviève also discussed the issues of challenges related with guardianship and the lack of protection. So this was actually the first day of the webinar of 20 years after implementing and going beyond the Palermo Protocol. So as I just said, the webinar will continue tomorrow. The third session tomorrow, which starts at 5, is called Human Rights of Trafficked and Exploited Persons Beyond the Palermo Protocol. And before closing, I would like now to give the opportunity, last but very much not least, to Maria Grazia Marimaro, who has initiated this event together with On the Road and the Mayor of Rome, Palermo, sorry, whose mandate will finish on 31st of July this year. And Maria Grazia, I hope you don't mind, but I would like to use this opportunity to thank you very much on behalf of La Strada International and all our members for your close cooperation with civil society in general and also with LSI, not only during your time as UN Rapporteur, but also at the European Commission and at the OSCE, and we hope to continue to closely cooperate with you. I would like to give the floor to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
It's okay.
Thank you very much. It's just about thanking all the participants for their patience to follow the webinar until so late. Actually, the time has been decided to enable our participants from the Americas to follow the webinar. And to say that I've learned a lot. The discussion was very rich. I need to think about it, to reflect about a number of new pathways. Because, for example, just to pick up something, of course, the conclusion of the webinar will be tomorrow. But it seems to me that the idea that state obligations are so much much more extended compared to what is written down in the Palermo Protocol. And these obligations are embedded in other international instruments that should be interpreted together with the Palermo Protocol, and in principle, human rights due diligence, the human rights international law, the due diligence principle, the anti-discrimination principle. So actually, what is important is to understand and to explain to agents in the field all the implications of this vision, which is much more elaborated than just one international instrument. So that actually, from this point of view, the idea of reorienting the implementation of national legislation in a human rights based approach, and the idea of a new instrument formalizing and comprising in an explicit with explicit formulation this state obligations are not they are basically the same thing. They are something a direction to be taken. The other thing I would like to pick up is that the alternative between voluntary schemes for businesses and state-imposed obligation has been challenged by from McDonald, in the sense that we should insist on the fact that governments have a tremendous power. Also, they have an impact with their own behavior. For example, public procurement on the behavior, on the business behavior. The problem is that very often states don't want to use this tremendous power and leave the market do their job, their dirty job, very in the vast majority of cases. So from this point of view, I think that we need more, again, more reflection and more elaboration about what we should ask. You know, what we should expect from governments and from businesses, without, of course, forgetting that, as Laura explained, you know, workers-led initiatives are much more effective in terms of empowerment of workers. Last but not least, Leonardo's question, which is completely political. It is true, there is a political wave, which is against human rights, that put into questions even rights that had been achieved, that were considered to taken for granted. Of course, there is no answer to this question, but the usual answer, but correct answer, that human rights advocates must, you know, continue to repeat. You know, it is a never-ending fight. The human rights, the fight for human rights, which is the fight to take all the possible opportunities to make the distance between principles and reality shorter. And of course, we are in a very difficult in a very difficult time. But even in difficult times, there must be someone saying things, and this is actually our role, waiting for better opportunities. Fortunately, history shows that you know, there are bad times, even horrible times, but then things can change. Thank you. So I'll wait for you tomorrow. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the speakers and moderators for this fantastic first day. And okay, I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Gradia. Thank you. Thank you for all.
Thank you very much.
You, everybody.
That's all.